Babur, the founder of the great Mughal Empire in India, was a foreign prince errant from the inconspicuous Principality of Farghana in Central Asia. He was not an ordinary soldier of fortune, but an outstanding man of letters and a passionate lover of his homeland. He conquered India in two hard-fought battles and by 1527 became her unchallenged master. He was not a Spartan, and his zest for enjoyment was prodigious, but even his excesses were humanized by a breath of poetry. His memoirs reveal the extent and depth of his perception and are justly held to rank with the confessions of St. Augustine and Rousseau and the memoirs of Gibbon and Newton. In spite of his glorious victories and possession of glittering prizes, his heart was never in India, and till the end of his life he yearned to return to his native land, which he loved with the passionate fervor of an exile. This remarkable man, who combined in himself the rare qualities of soldier, sportsman, and scholar, died in December 1530 at the age of 47. Of him we might well say with the poet, "Death makes no conquest of this conqueror, for now he lives in fame." His son and successor, Humayun, was wholly unequal to the task of consolidating the heritage bequeathed to him. He was defeated and expelled from the country by an Afghan, Sher Shah, whom a distinguished writer has acclaimed as the greatest of the Muslim rulers of India. In spite of his humble origin, Sher Shah rose to become one of the most benevolent sovereigns and showed unfailing interest and solicitude towards the poor peasants, for whose benefit he introduced far-reaching land reforms which were later adopted and improved upon by Akbar's minister, the sagacious Toramal. It was unfortunate that this excellent ruler could not, as he himself once exclaimed when observing his grey hair in a mirror, ascend the throne until the time of the evening prayer. After his death, the empire was regained by Humayun, who did not, however, live long to enjoy the sweets and delights of his recovered sovereignty. Then came Akbar, who by his benevolence and broad humanity won the love and esteem of his people, as the most sincere and gifted of all the incarnations of enlightened despotism. He abolished all hateful imposts and discriminatory measures intended to stigmatize non-Muslims as a conquered race. He condemned the bigotry and intolerance of his co-religionists by proclaiming the excellence of all faiths and set an example in Catholicity by prostrating himself before the God of all and discarding the priesthood of all. He promoted competent Hindus to positions of dignity, trust and responsibility and succeeded in winning their unswerving loyalty and devotion to his person and throne. Though Maharana Pratap Singh of Mewar stubbornly refused to render allegiance to the Emperor of Delhi and heroically suffered incredible privations by his defiance, most of the Rajput princes became enthusiastic supporters of Akbar's rule. The emperor was indeed far ahead of his times, and in his desire to establish a new order, he attempted to lead his people along the path of reform by forced marches. His synthetic religion deeply offended orthodox opinion and failed to win adherents outside his own intimate circle of companions and admirers. Akbar failed to see, as Augustus long before him had realized, that it is not good for the present to break too sharply with the past. Since the beginning of civilization, Festina Lente, make haste slowly, has furnished a sure foundation for the consolidation of human society. Apart from trying to play providence to his people, Akbar proved no challenge to his paramountcy. His conquests and annexations have been strongly condemned by many writers, and one historian goes so far as to describe him as a strong and stout annexationist before whose sun the modest star of Dalhousie pales. Nevertheless, Akbar was a titan who towered far above his contemporaries both in strength and wisdom. Robert Bryan assesses the emperor's character in these eloquent words: "The wonder of his age he does not diminish in stature with the passage of time, part mystic, part man of action, gentle and cruel, tolerant and self-willed, ascetic and voluptuary. He astonishes us today by the complexity, but still more by the intense force of his character." The hope expressed by his father that his fame would spread through all the world has been fulfilled. The child born in poverty and flight in the desert of Sindh became Akbar the great Mughal, one of the great men of the world. Jahangir, who succeeded his father, was a pleasure-loving monarch who, surrendering the cares and responsibilities of office to Nur Jahan, his beautiful but domineering queen, retired into the recesses of his palace to enjoy the delights of the wine cup in gay abandon. He set a wicked and dangerous example to his successors by aspiring for the throne even in the lifetime of his father. Sir Thomas Roe, King James' ambassador at Jahangir's court, was a man of keen perception and sound judgment. He observed in India the strange spectacle of darkness at noon. Behind an impressive facade of might and majesty, the Mughal Empire nursed a fatal malady. In these oft-quoted words, Roe pronounced his verdict on the Indian polity of the time, as exemplified by the emperor. His greatness substantially is not in itself, but in the weakness of his neighbors, whom like an overgrown pike he feeds on as fry. Pride, pleasure, and riches are their best description. Honesty and truth, discipline, civility they have none, or very little. The English envoy noticed that the Mughals were totally destitute of sea power. Even Akbar, who enjoyed a plenitude of military might in his reign, was forced to beseech the permission of the Portuguese for sending his ships to the Red Sea. Jahangir's indifference to the concerns of the state and his inaccessibility disgusted Roe, who complained that his mission to the emperor had brought him nothing but vexation, little honor, and less profit. The reign of Jahangir's son and successor Shah Jahan is memorable for the splendor of his court and for his mighty monuments. Under his rule, the Mughal power reached the greatest heights of glory. The immortal Taj Mahal, conceived as in a dream and executed like a jewel, furnishes a fitting tribute to the unique artistic sensibilities of the grand monarch. Describing the pomp and glitter of the Mughals, Macaulay wrote, "The beauty and magnificence of the buildings erected by the sovereigns of Hindustan amazed even travelers who had seen St. Peter's. The innumerable retinues and gorgeous decorations which surrounded the throne of Delhi dazzled even eyes which were accustomed to the pomp of the Versailles." But India under Shah Jahan lived far beyond her means, and his costly constructions, though welcome as an outstanding contribution to the country's cultural glory, seriously depleted and embarrassed the finances of the state. His encouragement of pomp and pageantry and the growing addiction of the court and the nobles to innovating luxury gravely undermined the moral and military strength of the empire. Truly did Seneca warn centuries ago that excess of anything strangles the soul. Besides his besetting weakness for expensive projects and pleasures, the emperor became an unmitigated bigot. He flagrantly misused state patronage to encourage apostasy. Unswerving in his allegiance to the family tradition, Aurangzeb, his son, captured the throne of Delhi by liquidating his rival brothers and by condemning his father to a life of enforced inaction at his Agra palace. He was, however, a remarkable man who, soon after his assumption of the imperial mantle, made a clean sweep of all the effeminacies and corruptions that had poisoned the court life. He lived in exemplary simplicity and was deeply versed in the theology of Islam, whose exacting prescriptions he tried to follow with undeviating devotion. Every circumstance favored his attaining fame as the greatest Mughal. It has, says Todd, seldom occurred that so many distinguished princes were contemporary as during the reign of Aurangzeb. But with a fatal wantonness, the emperor threw away the opportunity of capturing the hearts of the able men in the country. Despite his towering qualities, he was treacherous, suspicious, bigoted, and ambitious. He failed to perceive, as a Greek sophist had recognized long before him, that man is the measure of all things, standing supreme and apart from the rest of creation. If only Aurangzeb had known this simple but eternal truth, he would have realized the iniquity of persecuting his fellow men merely because his non-Muslim subjects chose to worship the God of all in their own way. His intolerable aversion for them, which haunted him like a malevolent spirit throughout his long reign, hastened his destruction and reduced the empire of Babur to dust and ashes. His quarrel with the premier Rajput states of Mewar and Marwar was suicidal. He incurred the undying enmity of the brave Rathors of Marwar by refusing to recognize the succession of Maharaja Jaswant Singh's infant son, except on his own insulting terms. With the aid of his superior resources and armies, the emperor carried sword and fire into Marwar. But however ruthless and extensive his devastations, the Rajputs successfully foiled his attempts to destroy the ancient state. They were led by the indomitable Durgadas, whose feats of valor and daring have won for him legendary fame in the annals of Rajasthan. Maharana Raj Singh of Mewar, the scion of the famous Rana Pratap, took up the cause of the helpless Maharanis and their infant son and delivered crippling blows at the invading armies, many of whose commanders, according to Sir Jadinath Sarkar, the eminent historian of the Mughals, preferred to stay in their camps or return to the security of their homes rather than face the desperate Rajputs. Raj Singh, who is criticized by Todd for his ill-judged humanity towards the wicked and unscrupulous invaders, addressed a letter of remonstrance to the emperor, reprimanding him for reviving the hateful jizya tax on the Hindus and for ruining the country by his morbid fanaticism. If your majesty, wrote the great Rajput, places any faith in those books by distinction called divine, you will there be instructed that God is the God of all mankind, not the God of Mohammedans alone. Sarkar believes that the letter was written not by Raj Singh but by Shivaji, the Maratha king, but its doubtful authorship does not by any means detract from the value of the epistle or reverse the fact that the Maharana of Mewar took the lead in drawing the sword against Aurangzeb's senseless persecution. Meanwhile, another formidable enemy began to attract the emperor's attention. As fighting men, the Marathas were in many ways different from the Rajputs. They were more than a match for the wily emperor and were not loath to use his own weapons to defeat his designs. They met stratagem with stratagem and treachery with intelligent anticipation. Their mode of warfare, helped by the terrain of the country, bewildered and demoralized the imperial forces. Against these brave and resourceful hillmen, Aurangzeb vainly hurled his armed hordes and after a prolonged conflict met his own doom and hastened the destruction of his empire. But he did not know that such a terrible fate awaited him when he left Ajmer for the Deccan on September 8, 1681. Shivaji, the founder of the Maratha Empire, was a man of genius who molded heroes out of clay and the glory of whose achievements has grown with the passage of time. His mother, a remarkable woman, ordered that her son should not sink into ignoble anonymity by joining the motley crowds that filled the Muslim courts. Assisted by an able and astute teacher and carefully trained him for the exalted mission of establishing justice, tolerance and righteousness in the country. He was taught to admire the heroes of the epics who were held before him as the splendid exemplars of the ancient world. Shivaji was a brilliant military commander who gained the admiration and affection of his troops, not only because he watched over every detail of their welfare and won his battles more by strategy than by blood, but also because he was always in the forefront of all actions where personal example and daring could settle the issue. His generous behavior towards the defeated enemy, his humanity, his sense of chivalry, and his respect for other faiths won him the unstinted admiration of even his most implacable enemies. No less a person than Khafi Khan, the court historian of Aurangzeb, concedes that the king of Maharashtra and his men made it a rule never to molest women or to hurt the religious susceptibilities of the Muslims. This remarkable characteristic of Shivaji's nature, says Justice Renade, stands out in marked contrast with the looseness and ferocity of those times. Another eminent writer, Dr. P.V. Kane, records that divine honors were paid to Shivaji even in his lifetime for so valiantly and effectively delivering his people from oppression and misrule. This great man who fought against tremendous odds throughout his life and finally succeeded in creating the Maratha nation almost by his own unaided exertions and devotion to noble causes, has won warm tribute from many discerning foreign writers. It required, says Monstuart Elphinstone, a genius like his to avail himself as he did of the mistakes of Aurangzeb, by kindling a zeal for religion and through that a national spirit among the Marathas. It was by these feelings that his government was upheld after it passed into feeble hands and was kept together in spite of numerous internal disorders until it had established its supremacy over the greater part of India. It was Maharashtra's great misfortune that Shivaji's eldest son, Sambhaji, proved himself utterly incompetent to carry on his father's exalted mission. He was a brave man, but an irresponsible and impetuous profligate, and during one of his drinking bouts, he was captured by Aurangzeb and offered life for apostasy. His indignant reply, though couched in a rather indecorous language, was a fitting rejoinder to the emperor's calculated affront to the son of a great man. Sambhaji paid with his life for his daring, and the details of his death rose his people to an all-consuming flame of detestation. There could be no compromise with the heartless invader. They decided to settle their accounts with him till either they or he perished. The war of liberation was carried on by the Marathas with amazing pertinacity, first under the leadership of Shivaji's younger son Rajaram, and after his death in March 1700 under his widow, the celebrated Tarabai, who by personal example and daring inspired her people to perform prodigies of valor in their campaigns against the Mughals. She caused immense mortification to Aurangzeb by proving the emptiness of his boast that after her husband's death he would succeed in annihilating the Marathas. Grand Duff gives a vivid description of the armed might that was hurled against the humble hillmen of Maharashtra. The display of power, he writes, presented by Aurangzeb's march into the Deccan was grand and imposing to a degree which has seldom been surpassed. The cavalry, assembled from different parts of India and from abroad, was the flower of his army and presented an array of gigantic men and horses. The infantry was no less numerous, well equipped, and terror-inspiring. The imperial artillery, consisting of a wide variety of cannons, was led by European gunners who had seen active service in many foreign lands. And yet, the seemingly invincible armies battled in vain against the hardy Marathas, who fought for their homeland with unexampled zeal in spite of the inferiority of their numbers and the poor quality of their arms. Thus, at the time of Aurangzeb's death on February 20, 1707, at Ahmednagar, his mighty forces, which had descended upon the Marathas 26 years before, had been reduced into a feeble and derelict instrument, thoroughly demoralized and inviting derisive comments on their ineffectiveness. The emperor died a sad and disillusioned man, belatedly realizing that his Himalayan follies and crimes accounted for the dissolution of his empire. Perhaps his career would have been less destructive and even useful had he known and realized the wisdom of Emperor Septimus' words. I have been everything and it is worth nothing.